Hello, and welcome to your weekly Overwatch League report, where we look at each individual team's performance in the past week of play and summarize the results while looking forward to what's ahead. We've got a lot to cover this week as the new meta continues to evolve, as well as some surprising performances this week from unexpected teams, and the continued domination of the league by its top three teams, with a fourth beginning to make a name for itself as well. So, let's get into it with a look at the team performances this past week. Starting off this week, we have the Paris Eternal. The Eternal went 1-1 this week with a 3-1 victory over the Florida Mayhem and a 1-2 loss to the Dallas Fuel. In general, the Eternals' performance this week was very comparable to their games from last week. They are perfectly capable of beating teams that they should beat. However, they struggle with teams that are at or around their same skill level. While the loss this week was much closer than their 0-4 loss last week to the Chengdu Hunters, with the Eternal appearing to be much more confident despite losing to the Fuel, the Eternals still have a lot to figure out if they want to compete for a playoff spot in Stage 2. The Eternal have an off week next week before they take on the London Spitfire and the Hanzhou Spark in Week 4. Perhaps an off week is just what the Eternal need to finally put together a run at one of the 8 playoff spots for Stage 2. Week 1 was certainly a tough week for the Mayhem, and unfortunately it seems like things won't be getting any easier for them based on the results of Week 2. This week saw the Mayhem go 0-2 again, with a 1-3 loss to the Paris Eternal, and them being swept by the New York Excelsiors. While the loss to New York is easy to understand, as New York seems to be in the business of sweeping almost every one of their opponents right now, the loss to the Eternal is more telling of the Mayhem's performance in this season so far. Despite the changes in the offseason, Mayhem just can't seem to come together to compete in every single game. While there have been highlights when it comes to the individual performance of players such as BQB and Saya Player, as a team, the Florida Mayhem still need to improve a lot before they can be considered a contender. Unfortunately, things don't get much easier for the Mayhem next week as they take on the red-hot LA Gladiators. We'll see if the Mayhem can figure out a strategy for cooling off one of the hottest teams in the league at the moment. In other news today, the sky is blue, the grass is green, and the New York Excelsiors are a good Overwatch team. The Excelsiors' domination of the regular season continued this past week with them going, now stop me if you heard this one before, 2-0 while sweeping both of their opponents. Now, if I had been doing this since middle of season last year, I could have used the same script to describe New York's success in the regular season several times over by now. Now, while you can see the two games this week were against some relatively weaker teams, with wins over Florida and Washington, it's still hard to deny just how well New York is playing right now. However, next week they could face their first real test of the regular season, as they take on the Philadelphia Fusion, who, if you remember, are the team that knocked them out of the semifinals in last year's season playoffs. While the Fusion may have changed a bit in the offseason, it will be interesting to see how New York performs against them in Season 2. New York will also play the Atlanta Reign next week Friday. Well, if nothing else, you can't blame the Justice for not trying. While they still don't have a win in Stage 2, they did at least put up a fight in the games they were in this week. Regardless, they still find themselves winless after losing 0-4 to the New York Excelsiors and 1-3 to the Atlanta Reign. The season has certainly been tough for the Justice, and while it's nice to see them avoid being completely swept this week, it's pretty obvious that they still have a lot to figure out. With players such as Corey, Otto, and Guido doing their best to carry their team through the season, there is some good news for the Justice. However, they still have a long way to go before I think we ever really see them compete for a coveted playoff spot. All is not lost for the Justice, though, as they do have a winnable game next week against the struggling LA Valiant. If the Justice can come together before then and plan out a sound strategy against Space and the Valiant, then it could be possible that we see the Justice get their first win of Stage 2. Despite going 2-0 again this week, the Titans showed that they were indeed mortals. About as mortal as Titans can be, but still, we saw that they weren't entirely unbeatable. Titans beat the Dynasty 3-1, and the Outlaws also 3-1. In the match against the Outlaws in particular, the Titans' opponents took the lead early on and seemingly took them off guard with some unique team compositions. And then the Titans turned things around the second map on, and it was more or less the same team we saw who won the Stage 1 championship. The main takeaway from this week? The Titans are still really good, but next week they face two teams who may actually present a challenge to the Titans' perfect record, with games against the Fuel and the surprisingly solid Uprising. Out of all the teams Titans have faced this stage, they present the greatest challenge so far, but if we go off their performance from this week, it's likely that the winning streak will continue. The Dynasty's roller coaster of a season continued with a tough matchup against the reigning champion Titans. Like many teams that are around the middle of the pack in the Overwatch League, there are certainly moments of brilliance for the Dynasty. However, when it comes time to finish out a map, they can never seem to cross that final obstacle to achieve victory. Granted that the obstacle this week was the Titans, but still, there are instances where the Dynasty were just so close to taking a close game and failing to do so. Whether that's making some small mistakes here or there, or just a simple matter of miscommunication, the fact is that the Dynasty have the tools to be a great team and have shown us what that looks like in the past, but now they just need to play consistently to truly be considered as a contender. Next week presents an opportunity for the Dynasty to correct themselves with a match against the Fuel, who are certainly a strong team, but one that I believe the Dynasty can beat if they show up and play like the team we all know they can be. It was certainly a tough week for the Toronto Defiant, as they found themselves on the undesirable side of a sweep, losing to the Dallas Fuel and losing 1-3 to the Philadelphia Fusion. Despite some decent performances from the likes of IV and IM37, the Defiant still appear to be struggling when it comes time to pull it all together to grab that map win. At times, the squad appears to be uncoordinated or unsure when they want to engage in that team fight, and often it's that indecision that leads to them losing. What's weird is that we've seen the Defiant play a lot better than how they're performing now, and recently the performances we've seen from the squad are not what we expected from them coming into this stage. While this could be a result of the team still needing time to adjust to the roster changes they made in the offseason, until they can get the rest of their game plan organized, it's likely that we won't see the Defiant going to the playoffs in this stage. Granted, that doesn't mean they should be written off entirely, as this is the team that managed some decent wins in Stage 1. So, even though things may not look the best for the Defiant at the moment, don't be surprised if you start to see the Defiant getting more wins in the future. Next week, the Defiant have another tough matchup as they go up against the San Francisco Shock. Well, while everyone expected the Fusion to take care of the Defiant this week, the match that every Fusion fan had their eye on was their matchup against their rivals, the London Spitfire. Despite their best efforts, however, the Fusion fell just short of avenging their defeat in the championship last year and lost 2-1. It was certainly a close match, and the Fusion played extremely well with some notable performances from Carpe and Poco, but in the end it just wasn't enough to close out that final game 4 and beat the Spitfire. Let it be known that the Fusion looked much better this week when you compare the performance to the previous week's performance, and despite losing to the Spitfire, the Fusion are starting to look like the team that made it to the finals last year. Speaking of last year's playoffs, the Fusion have a daunting task next week of taking on the team they beat to get to the finals, the New York Excelsior. This will certainly be one of the better games to watch this upcoming week, as the Fusion pose as the best team to break New York's unbeaten regular season streak so far. So if you can only watch one game on Thursday, watch this one. They will also take on the Outlaws later in the week. Well, it certainly was a big week for the Valiant now, wasn't it? They were finally able to get their first victory of the season against the Atlanta Reign. That's right, not first win of the stage, of the entire season. In fact, the Valiant actually looked pretty good against the Reign, taking them to map 5, and things were actually looking pretty good. But it didn't get a whole lot better once they took on their in-city rival, Gladiators. It was certainly close though, as the Valiant forced a draw and even took a map from the Red Hot Gladiators. I would also like to point out the performance of Space, in particular, who gave a great performance on D.Va this week. In the end, however, it wasn't enough to get the victory over the Gladiators and claim the title of Best Team in LA. Add in the bad blood that already exists between these two teams, as well as some interesting conversations between the team's social media accounts, and I'm sure that this is a game that the Valiant would want another chance at. Despite this, the Valiant are finally starting to show signs of life in this stage, And with a game next week against the Justice, it's possible that we can see another win for the Valiant sometime soon. Meanwhile, the struggles continue this week for the Atlanta Reign. As mentioned before, they were the first team to lose to the Valiant this season. It's apparent that following the loss to the Fran in the offseason, the Reign are still trying to pull themselves back together. But it wasn't all doom and gloom for them this week, as they did manage to put away the Justice with a 3-1 win. Baby Bay is starting to look more comfortable in the team, but still is prone to making mistakes from time to time, and Pokpo is still playing solid at the tank position, but it would seem that the team just needs more time to re-establish their identity. Unfortunately for them, they don't necessarily have it easy come next week as they take on the New York Excelsior, but they also have another match against the struggling Charge, which could be just the game that Reign need to get their confidence back on track. After pulling off 3 straight reverse sweeps in the past few weeks of competition, many people, including myself, were likely ready to label the Uprising as one of the better teams in the league. That might have changed, however, as this week saw the Uprising fall to the Spark. It was certainly a close game, and the Uprising were in it until the very end of Map 5, and in most other situations should have won that final map. But a weak defensive stand at 99% on the final map led to the Spark capturing the point and ultimately to a victory as they would pull off the comeback to take the final map of the match. Despite the tough loss though, the Uprising are still in the running for a Stage 2 playoff spot, but given 2 tough matchups next week against the Spitfire and the Titans, it's likely that the Uprising will have to work pretty hard if they want to see themselves in the playoffs again. Despite this week's loss, don't count them out just yet, as the Uprising have been known to make comebacks before in the past, and so far there is certainly no reason to believe that there won't be another comeback for the Uprising in the near future. As for the Spark, this was just what they needed after being swept by the Vancouver Titans last week. The Spark showed that they can still compete against some of the better teams in the league, and while they didn't play perfectly for the entire match against the Uprising, they were still able to get the job done when they needed to. Crystal's Brigitte managed to carry the team in key fights to take the objective, while their main takes Gushui and Ria both provide solid performances in their roles as well. We'll finally be able to see more of the Spark next week as they take on the Charge and the Shock. After those 2 games, we should get a better idea of how close the Spark are to competing for a playoff spot in Stage 2. Confusion and disappointment. These appear to be the main themes for the Charge in Stage 2. Once again, the Charge were unable to win even a single map this past week. Out of all the underperforming teams in the league this season, this is probably the most confusing one out of the bunch. Looking at the Charge before the stage, you would see that its roster is filled with players who you would think would thrive in the new meta that has emerged following the latest patch. While the Charge would occasionally pull off a few good games with Goat's comp in Stage 1, almost everyone said that this would be the squad to look out for when the meta finally changed back to one where DPS heroes were more prevalent. Well, 2 weeks in, and it seems like we're still waiting for the rumored squad to show up. Now, I'll give the Charge some leniency, as they have certainly had a tough schedule so far at the stage, going up against some of the best teams such as the Excelsiors, the Shock, and the Gladiators so far. However, one would have expected more than 4 losses with 0 map wins in the entire stage. I can't really think of a reason as to why the Charge have performed like this so far, but I hope whatever it is, the team can get situated soon. Next week, the Charge do have a slightly easier schedule, with matches against the Spark and the Reign. If nothing else, we'll see if the Charge can finally stabilize themselves next week and at least get a few map wins. Ever since losing in the Stage 1 championship to the Titans, the Shock have been out to prove that they still belong at the top of the league, and this past week's performance certainly won't make you think otherwise. With a 4-0 sweep over the Charge this past week, the Shock remain undefeated in Stage 2, and given how dominant they looked on maps such as Blizzard World and Gibraltar, I don't think anyone will necessarily doubt the squad's conviction to getting back to the stage finals again. Once again, the Shock got great performances from players such as Rascal, who is showing off just how effective Baptiste can be in the new meta, and Sinatra, who continues to be one of the best Zaryas in the league while also being able to flex with his Sombra as well. Looking ahead, the Shock have a pretty good chance of continuing on their road to redemption, as they have matches against the Defiant and the Spark, both games that, on paper, should be entirely winnable for the Shock. Not much more can be said about the Shock, other than that opponents better look out if they find themselves between this squad and the Stage 2 playoffs. Well, this certainly was unexpected. After showing us that the meta doesn't matter to the Hunters in the past few weeks, who would have thought that the team that would bring them back down to earth after the new patch would be the Dragons? After a slow start in Map 1, the Hunters tied it up again on Paris, and seemed to have all the momentum on their side going into halftime. However, the Hunters would play uncharacteristically poor in the next two maps, ultimately falling to the Dragons 1-3. After giving strong performances against the likes of the Eternal, it was expected that the Hunters were ready to take over the league in Stage 2. However, if this game is anything to go by, maybe the Hunters' playstyle, which relies on confusing their opponents, could finally have been comprehended by teams in the league. If that's the case, it may be time for the Hunters to adopt a more traditional playstyle again. However, it may be too early to make that judgment just yet. Next week, the Hunters take on the Gladiators, which will be one of the biggest challenges that the Hunters have faced so far this stage. This will be the game where we will get a good idea of whether or not the Hunter's crazy compositions still hold up in the new meta. As for the Dragons, this is certainly a much needed win after coming off an 0-2 performance last week. Despite some difficulties on Paris, the Dragons played surprisingly well throughout the rest of the match. Behind some strong performances from the likes of Diem, Ding, and Luffy, the Dragons appear to have put things together at this stage, finally finding some good compositions that work for the team, and knowing when to switch off heroes that don't work for the situation they are in, a problem that was oddly prevalent for the Dragons last week. Luckily, that wasn't an issue for them in this match, and we are finally starting to see more of the Dragons that we had in Stage 1. It'll be interesting to see if the Dragons can give the same performance next week with matches against the Mayhem and the Outlaws, both winnable games if the Dragons can play the way they did this week against the Hunters. After plenty of scrutiny was directed at the Spitfire's performance in Stage 1, London finally appears to be back in form after defeating the Fusion 2-1 in a tightly contested game from start to finish. Problems that plagued London during this first stage of Season 2 seem to finally be going away for the team as they continue to iron out their strategy with the new meta. And with players such as Fury and Prophet leading the way for the Spitfire, it's likely that we'll start to see more of the team that were crowned champions last season. In addition to perfecting their GOATS comp this stage, the Spitfire are also likely to see more success as they begin to incorporate heroes into their comps that more suit the style of play for players such as Birdring. Once the team are able to master comps that embrace this new meta, it's likely that we'll be seeing the squad back in the playoffs more frequently from this point on. Next week, the Spitfire face a dangerous Uprising team, but if the Spitfires stick to the strategy that worked for them this week, then it's likely that we will see the Spitfire continue to move back into position as one of the better teams in the league and be one step closer to competing for a stage championship. After not seeing the Outlaws compete for several weeks due to them missing the playoffs and having a Week 1 bye to start Stage 2, the Outlaws returned to the Overwatch League with the difficult task of having to play the Stage 1 champions in their first game back for Stage 2. Coming out of the gate, the Outlaws actually took the Titans, and much of the audience watching the game, by surprise by easily taking Game 1 from the Titans through the use of DPS-centric comps that changed the pace of play and seemingly took their opponents off guard. After putting up a strong defensive stand on Paris, allowing the Titans only to take Point A, the new Outlaws looked like they may actually be able to compete with the champs and possibly be the first team to beat the Titans this season. Then, the decision was made for the Outlaws to run Goats on attack, and it quickly fell apart from there. The Titans, despite being taken off guard by the Outlaws' more DPS-heavy comps, quickly adjusted to the Outlaws' picks and promptly stopped the Outlaws from getting any closer to taking any more maps from the Titans, leading to the Outlaws losing 1-3. This must have been particularly frustrating for Outlaw fans, as not only did the Outlaws use the new meta to catch the Titans off guard on Map 1, they actually looked like one of the best teams to utilize the new meta so far this stage. That's why the decision to play Goats was so surprising, as the Outlaws have never really had particularly strong Goats play, and was one of the reasons they found themselves out of the playoffs in Stage 1. In this case, the Outlaws just refused to play the heroes that best suited their players' abilities, and it showed, especially on Eichenwald, where on attack the Outlaws again used a DPS comp to quickly take the payload, but then switched to goats and were unable to move the payload to the next checkpoint. Hopefully, this serves as an example that the Outlaws play their best when they play the heroes that suit players such as Linkser and Jake, although credit should be given to Muma, who continues to be a great tank regardless of whether the team plays goats or not. Next week, the Outlaws take on the Fusion and the Dragons, where we'll see if the Outlaws commit to playing the new meta or if they still try to make goats work. And finally, we have the Dallas Fuel, who returned to the Overwatch League this week with victories over the Eternal and the Defiant. These were certainly statement victories for the squad, as many people are now starting to give the Fuel more attention after a relatively average Stage 1 performance. In general, the Fuel just appeared to be better overall compared to their performance in the previous stage, and while they weren't bad by any means, the Fuel that we saw this week is much better and were able to quickly identify their opponent's strategy and systematically dismantle it for some relatively easy victories. Players such as AKM are looking even better in his DPS role, and with Baptiste now in the game, the Fuel have a great flex support in Zachary, who was already utilizing the new hero to great effect. Of course, this past week, the teams the Fuel played aren't necessarily on top of the power rankings, but it still looks as though the Fuel are ready to compete for a playoff spot in Stage 2. They'll take on the Titans and the Dynasty this week, two teams that will certainly give the Fuel a challenge. We'll see if the Fuel are ready to compete with the best in the league, or if everything I just said about them was a fluke. To wrap up this review, I'll be giving you at least one game to watch every day this week. So if you can only watch one game a day, that will be the one that should be the most interesting to watch. The match I'm looking forward to the most on Thursday is, no surprise, the Excelsiors versus the Fusion, which will be a great matchup between two of the best teams in the league right now. As for Friday, I would actually recommend the Valiant versus the Justice, due to the fact that even though they may not be the best teams at the moment, this game could prove to be a turning point in the season for one of these teams should they win. On Saturday, you'll want to watch the Hunters versus the Gladiators, as one of the most entertaining teams in the league goes up against the team that is quickly rising up the ladder in terms of power rankings. And finally, on Sunday, I'd recommend the game between the Titans and the Uprising. This is likely the best chance that anyone has had to beat the Titans' undefeated streak so far this season. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the Uprising managed to pull off an upset. With that, this is where I'll end this week's recap. Given my schedule, I'll try my best to make another review for this week's matches as well, so be on the lookout for that around this time the following week. School is starting to get crazy at the moment, so my schedule isn't really set in stone, but I'll try my best to get you that video out as soon as I can. If you like what you saw today, your feedback is appreciated. If you didn't like it, which I totally get by the way, since I'm aware this isn't necessarily the best content out there at the moment, your constructive criticism is requested in the comment section, and I'll see what I can do to improve from there. Until the next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy this week's matches.